Thanks to the efforts of such pioneers as Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo Galilei, we know that the planets in our solar system orbit the Sun. For Earth, this process takes approximately 365 days, and for Saturn 10,759 days, or the equivalent of 29.5 Earth years. Indeed, if we lived on Saturn, we'd be very lucky to make the age of 3. Upon pondering this fact, the 9th century Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali reasoned that if the solar system has existed in this form forever, as the Greeks believed, then we are confronted by an outrageously absurd fact. Despite the Earth's significantly quicker orbit than Saturn, both have made the same number of orbits. Infinite. Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you're well. In this series we're going to delve into the Kalam Cosmological argument, covering the most popular historical and contemporary ways in which it's been and still is defended. But I'm not conducting this hefty project alone. No, as given away by the intro and elsewhere, I'm collaborating with the illustrious Joe Schmid, who in addition to contributing to the literature himself, has had many a conversation with other contributors, including the likes of Robert Koons, Josh Rasmussen, Wes Moritzen, Alex Malpass and Graham Oppie. Truly, Schmid is the Spider-Man of the Kalam.
This is insane, insane. Look at this thing. Look at the eyes. This is the greatest day of my life.
Let's go.
Okay.
Hey peeps, I'm Joe Schmid from the Majesty of Reason, and I'm here to bring some of that majestic reason to the series. Anyway, here's a breakdown of what's to come. In this first video, we'll provide a brief historical overview of the Kalam, distinguish its stages and the two main forms of the argument, and finally define some terms. In the second video, we'll focus on stage 1 of what we'll call the Old Kalam. In particular, we'll focus on the causal principle, as well as the purported scientific support for the universe's beginning from Big Bang cosmology. In the third video, we'll address philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, based on the impossibility of actual infinites. After a stay at Hilbert's Hotel, we'll visit Craig's library and beyond.
Hilbert's Hotel, if it could exist, would have to have a sign posted outside. No vacancy. Guests welcome.
In the fourth video, we'll assess even more philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past. In particular, we'll assess those based on the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition, the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite, and many more. In the fifth video, we'll shift focus to stage 1 of what we'll call the New Kalam. In particular, we'll discuss causal finitism, and assess the arguments and paradoxes leveled on its behalf. And finally, in the sixth video, we'll tackle stage 2 of the Kalam. We'll assess the various inferences to divine attributes made by proponents of the Kalam, and we'll also uncover potential problems that arise for God's relation to the beginning of time. Alrighty, let's get to it.
According to Aristotle, the infinite is that what has no limit. For instance, the sequence of numbers is infinite because for each number there is another higher number that follows. Likewise, for each number, say minus 666, there is a number that precedes it. Given this, Aristotle reasoned, the universe must have existed forever, since for every day there is a preceding day. The better part of a millennia later, John Philoponus sought to challenge Aristotle's eternity, and in doing so vindicate the Old Testament account of the creation of the universe. Philoponus argued that if the present cosmological order had existed in its present state for an eternity of past time, then time and the past generations of men and plants and the other individuals of each species would be actually infinite. Or in other words, Philoponus reasoned that if the universe has always existed in its present state, then by the time Socrates was born there must have already existed an actually infinite number of human beings, which is a contradiction, since, upon Socrates' birth, the number of humans would have surpassed an actual infinite. What's more, he continued, since souls are immortal, then, by virtue of an infinite number of humans having already existed, there must be an actually infinite number of human souls in existence at this very moment, which he, like Aristotle, considered impossible. Thus, Philoponus and his followers were confident that they had proven that the universe can't be eternal, but many others were not so impressed, including Thomas Aquinas. In considering the argument from the infinity of souls, he remarked, "But this argument is not to the point, for God could have made the world without making men or creatures with souls, or he could have made men when in fact he did make them, even if he had made the rest of the world from eternity." Furthermore, Aquinas argued that just because the universe owes its existence to God, it doesn't follow that there must have been a time when the universe didn't exist. He writes, God, however, never lacks any kind of complementary cause in order to produce an effect. Therefore, at any instance at which God exists, so too can his effects, and thus God need not precede his effects in time. To bolster his point, he asks us to consider a footprint in the sand that has existed forever. Despite there being no moment before the footprint was made, we would still recognise, he argues, that the cause of the print was a foot.
But wait, there's more!
Aquinas also expressed that it hasn't been proven that an actual infinite cannot exist, stating, it has not yet been demonstrated that God cannot cause an infinite number of things to exist simultaneously. But despite Philoponus' arguments holding little sway among Christian theologians, Islamic theologians embraced him with open arms, as they too were eager to vindicate the doctrine of creation. That the Islamic theologians knew of his works, wrote William Lane Craig, is evident from their bibliographical references. Springboarding from Philoponus, Al-Kindi, for instance, argued that any moment, such as the present, could never be reached if time were infinite. Before the present moment could be reached, an infinite number of former times would have to have elapsed. In his book titled The Kalam Cosmological Argument, Craig gave the example of dividing up time into hours. If we do this, then before this very moment was reached, an infinite number of hours would have to have elapsed. But, according to the argument, the infinite cannot be traversed. Consequently, the present moment can never arrive, and yet, it has. Which is absurd.
Absurd.
Al-Kindi's arguments are not, however, strictly tethered to causation, but rather time. In Craig's words, Al-Kindi does not argue that every event has to have a cause and that the series of causes cannot be infinite. The use of the causal principle is not to be found here, for Kindi's arguments are based simply on the notion of the succession of temporal segments. A few centuries later, however, Al-Ghazali did include the causal principle through reference to temporal phenomena. It is significant to note, Craig emphasises, that Ghazali does not, like Al-Kindi, base his argument on the finitude of time. Rather, he argues from temporal phenomena, not time itself. In The Incoherence of Philosophers, Al-Ghazali presents the following syllogism, and it has remained, more than less, unchanged. Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning. Ghazali supports this premise by showing the absurdities involved in the supposition of the eternity of the world, that is, in an infinite regress of temporal phenomena. For example, it leads to the absurdity of infinities of different sizes, for Jupiter revolves once every 12 years, Saturn every 30 years, and the sphere of the fixed stars every 36,000 years. If the world were eternal, then these bodies will each have completed an infinite number of revolutions, and yet one will have completed twice as many, or even thousands of times as many revolutions as another, which is absurd. In concluding his chapter on Al-Ghazali, Craig reminds us that the fact that the solar system hasn't existed forever is irrelevant. These philosophical arguments are of metaphysical concern, not physical. Ghazali's arguments may appear rather quaint, presupposing as they do the constancy of the solar system and the life of man upon Earth. But the problems raised in the illustrations are real ones, for they raise the question of whether an infinite number or number of things can actually exist in reality. Ghazali argues that this results in all sorts of absurdities, therefore the series of temporal phenomena cannot regress infinitely. And with that, we conclude our brief history of the Kalam. There are many more important contributors and arguments that we haven't covered here, but should you be interested in a more detailed account, then we highly recommend getting your hands on this book. It's superbly written and jam-packed with information. Talking of which, it was the publication of this book that popularised the Kalam among the Western world, and as of today, it's one of, if not the, most prominent theological argument, having garnered the attention of some brilliant minds. So, even if you don't find the various defences convincing, it's still worthwhile being informed.
The Kalam can be broken down into two stages. Stage 1 aims to infer at least one first cause of the universe, or temporal reality, or causal chains, or physical reality, or what have you. It usually includes a causal principle, plus a denial that some kind of infinity obtains. Stage 2 aims to infer important divine attributes of the entity arrived at in Stage 1. It can proceed via conceptual analysis, reasoning based on the causal or explanatory role the entity plays in Stage 1, or other features of the entity's effect, like beauty or order or fine-tuning. With the two stages of the Kalam covered, we can now consider the Kalam itself. There are two major variants of the Kalam cosmological argument. The most familiar variant, the one championed by William Lane Craig among others, is what we'll call the Old Kalam. Old because it originated much earlier than the other variant. The other variant, what we'll call the new Kalam, is based on causal finitism, and has been championed by Alexander Pruss and Rob Koons and others. Whenever we speak of the Kalam, we're referring to both variants. Whenever we want to refer to only one of them, we'll just specify which. Okay, so on to stage 1 of the Old Kalam. The Old Kalam is defended by thinkers like Al-Ghazali, William Lane Craig, Andrew Locke, and many others. Our purpose in this part of the video is to sketch the Old Kalam, distinguish it from the New Kalam, and define various terms essential for understanding the Old Kalam. We won't examine the justifications of and responses to its premises until later on in the series. The premise-by-premise form of the Old Kalam's first stage runs as follows, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, so the universe has a cause. The distinguishing feature of the Old Kalam is that it marshals arguments in support of premise 2 that don't rely on causal finitism, the view that every causal chain leading up to something must be finite. Instead, they rely either on scientific evidence from Big Bang cosmology or more traditional philosophical arguments like the impossibility of actual infinites, the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite, and so on. So we've used lots of terms like universe and actual infinite and begins to exist and so on. Before we can proceed with our series, we do need a clear understanding of what these various terms mean by taking eternal advice from Voltaire by defining our terms. Now, if we were writing a book, it's here that we'd spend some considerable time unpacking each definition. However, this approach isn't quite as effective in video format, and so we're simply going to provide the definitions below in a Google document, and unpack on video each definition as and when they are relevant to the episode at hand. For instance, since within this video we're going to provide the most prominent objection to the argument from infinites of different sizes, we'll expand upon the relevant definitions now. So let's get to it.
Infinity. In a loose and imprecise sense, whatever is infinite has no end or limit or bound. In a stricter and more precise sense, infinite quantities or magnitudes are those that are measurable but have no finite measure. And likewise, infinite lines, surfaces, or volumes are measurable lines, surfaces, or volumes that have no finite measure. Their measure, instead, is greater than any finite number. And an infinite is just an infinite measure of some kind. For instance, an infinite quantity, an infinite magnitude, an infinite volume, or, indeed, an infinite cringe. Infinitely related to infinity is set theory. Now, don't worry, this sounds like maths, and I entirely appreciate that some of you, when you hear maths, will have this reaction. But don't worry, it's relatively easy to follow.
A set is just a collection of distinct things. The things in the collection are called elements, or members of the set. A set X is a subset of a set Y, just in case every element of X is an element of Y, and thus every set is a subset of itself. Sets X and Y are identical, just in case X is a subset of Y, and Y is a subset of X. Thus, X and Y are identical sets, just in case there's no difference in their respective elements. Finally, a set X is a proper subset of a set Y, just in case X is a subset of Y, but X is not identical to Y. Thus, given the aforementioned identity conditions on sets, if X is a proper subset of Y, then every element of X is in Y, but there's at least one element of Y which is not in X. A set's cardinality is a measure of its size, that is, the number of elements in the set. For instance, the set containing the numbers 2, 4, and 6 has a cardinality of 3. That's because it has 3 elements, or members. An infinite set is just a set with infinitely many members. For our purposes, we'll only be focusing on sets whose cardinality is the same as the set of the natural numbers. That is, the set of 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on ad infinitum. The cardinality of this kind of infinite set is Aleph null. Aleph null is the first, or smallest, infinite cardinal number. This kind of infinite set is said to have Cantor's property. A set has Cantor's property when it can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with infinitely many of its proper parts, so that the whole set has the same cardinality, that is, the same size or number of elements, as those proper subsets. For instance, there are just as many natural numbers as there are even numbers, despite the fact that the even numbers are a proper subset of the natural numbers. Any set with the same cardinality as the set of natural numbers, that is, the cardinality Aleph null, has Cantor's property.
And the final distinction we need to cover is that between an actual infinite and a potential infinite. An actual infinite is a complete infinite collection. It is a collection of definite and discrete members whose number is greater than any natural number. An example is the set of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. A potential infinite is, strictly speaking, not infinite at all. It is a quantity that 1 is increasing, 2 has no finite limit, and 3 is always finite. As Craig puts it, a potential infinite collection is one in which the members are not definite in number but may be increasing without limit. A potential infinite is thus always finite but always increasing. For instance, if I start counting 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on without end, then as time progresses the quantity of numbers that will have been counted is always finite but always increasing. Now, all these distinctions and definitions serve as the foundation for this series. Take the time to absorb them and refer to them at your pleasure through the Google Doc in the description. And with that, let's turn our attention to that which can be considered stage 1 of the new Kalam.
The new Kalam is defended by thinkers like Alex Pruss, Rob Koons, Jacobus Erasmus, and others. Its reliance on causal finitism distinguishes it from the old Kalam. Causal finitism is the thesis that nothing can have an infinite causal history. In other words, there cannot be infinitely many causes affecting, directly or indirectly, one target state or substance or event. So here is the premise-by-premise form of the new Kalam's first stage, and this is drawn from Pruss, 2018, pages 181 to 182. 1. Nothing has an infinite causal history. 2. There are no causal loops. So a causal loop is just a circular causal chain. That is a causal chain where X directly or indirectly causes itself. 3. Something has a cause. 4. Therefore, there is an uncaused cause. Now, this argument is valid in that its premises entail the conclusion. Suppose that premise 3 is true. That is, suppose that x0 is something that has a cause, say x1. Now suppose, for reductio, that every cause is itself caused. Since every cause is caused, x1 has a cause x2, which has a cause x3, and so on. Moreover, by premise 2, the x's are all distinct, which implies that x0 has an infinite causal history. But by premise 1, nothing has an infinite causal history, so something has an infinite causal history, and nothing has an infinite causal history. A contradiction. Thus, our original assumption for reductio, that every cause is itself caused, is false. Thus, there is at least one uncaused cause. Now, we didn't just prove that there is at least one uncaused cause. Instead, we proved that, given the truth of each of the premises, it follows that there is at least one uncaused cause. In other words, we simply showed that the argument is valid. Whether the premises are true or justified is a separate question, one which we'll take up later in our series.
And the final distinction we need to make, at least for now, is the 3 different kinds of finitism: causal finitism, dependence finitism, and strict finitism. As we've seen, causal finitism holds that, necessarily, every causal history is finite. In other words, causal sequences leading up to any event, state, or substance must be finite. This rules out infinite regresses of causes. Other ways to articulate causal finitism include 1. There is no possible world in which there exists an infinitely descending chain of causal power dependencies. 2. Nothing can be affected, directly or indirectly, by infinitely many causes. And 3. There cannot be infinitely many things that causally impact one target state. All of these ways accurately capture the general thrust of causal finitism. Dependence finitism holds that, necessarily, nothing depends on infinitely many other things. This entails that no single thing depends, directly or indirectly, on infinitely many things. Dependence finitism is thus stronger than causal finitism in that it entails causal finitism, since causation is just some kind of dependency among others, whereas causal finitism does not entail dependence finitism. Or in other words, dependence finitism could be false even though causal finitism is true, but not vice versa. And strict finitism is even stronger still. Strict finitism holds that any infinite whatsoever is impossible. That is, that there cannot be infinite magnitudes, infinite quantities, infinite regresses, or anything else that entails some actual infinite. Another way to put this is that strict finitism is the thesis that all actual infinites are impossible. Anyhow, with these definitions in mind, let's turn to stage 2 of the Kalam.
Stage 2 of the Kalam aims to tease out various attributes of the entity or entities arrived at in stage 1. Since the Kalam is an argument for God's existence, these attributes are meant to be divine attributes. For instance, immateriality, timelessness, intelligence, personhood, enormous power, and so on. One way to proceed with stage 2 is through conceptual analysis. This involves asking what kind of thing could be the cause of the universe. By conceptual analysis, defenders of the Kalam allege that we can infer lots of things about the cause. It must, for instance, be timeless, at least without the universe, since it is the cause of time, and hence cannot be part of the very thing it is bringing into being. It would thereby be bringing itself into being. It must also be immaterial, since it is the cause of material things, and hence cannot be part of the very thing, again, it is bringing into existence, and so on. Remember, we're dedicating an entire video in our series to Stage 2. For present purposes, we're just giving you a sense of what Stage 2 looks like. Another way to proceed with Stage 2 is through reasoning based on the causal or explanatory role the entity plays in Stage 1. For instance, suppose we conclude from conceptual analysis that the entity is timeless. But we concluded from Stage 1 that this timeless entity caused the universe to begin to exist. Well, we can ask, how can a timeless cause give rise to a non-eternal effect with a beginning in time? Well, it would seem that the timeless cause couldn't necessitate its effect, because then surely the effect would be co-eternal with the cause. But we purportedly learned from Stage 1 that the universe is not eternal, and so it's not co-eternal with its cause. So, the cause of the universe does not necessitate its effect. But in that case, perhaps the best or only explanation for this indeterminism or non-necessitation is that the cause has free will. Again, we aren't here to evaluate this inference. We'll do that in a later video, and we'll unpack it further in a later video. A still further way to proceed is by examining other features of the entity's effect, like beauty or order or fine-tuning and so on. And in inferring on that basis, certain features of the cause. For instance, one might argue that the order and intelligibility of the universe is much more expected under the hypothesis that the cause of the universe is intelligent than under the hypothesis that the cause of the universe is mindless and indifferent. If this is true, then the order and intelligibility of the universe strongly supports the hypothesis that the cause is intelligent and hence personal. Our goal here is simple. We want you to understand the purpose of Stage 2, as well as the methodology used to make the various inferences. We'll criticize Stage 2 quite heavily in the 6th video in our series. Until then, though, you're just gonna have to simmer in your excitement and anticipation.
Before wrapping up, let's enjoy a small bite of the meal we've been teasing by considering the primary response given by mathematicians and philosophers to the argument laid out at the beginning, pertaining to the absurdity of infinites of different sizes. There are many ways to dress up this argument, and perhaps the most famous is Al-Ghazali's orbits of the solar system. Despite, for instance, Saturn taking 30 times longer than the Earth to orbit the Sun, if the constancy of the solar system had existed forever, that is, if the world were eternal, then these bodies will each have completed an infinite number of revolutions, and yet one will have completed twice as many, or thousands of times as many revolutions as another, which is absurd. Now, this might be absurd in the sense that it's somewhat unintuitive, but it's not absurd in the sense that it's unreasonable, illogical, or contradictory. Once we acknowledge and appreciate the one-to-one correspondence between the elements in each set, we can see that there's simply not a problem. One's untutored intuition might initially give some inkling of a problem, but deeper reflection furnishes us with an equally powerful intuitive grasp of why and how the planets have the same number of orbits. All in all, then, the thought experiment of infinite orbits of different sizes simply fails to show the impossibility of actual infinites or a beginningless past. In fact, it illustrates nothing more, nor less, than the coherent and perfectly understandable Cantor's property. In the case of sets with infinite cardinalities, the whole set can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with infinitely many of its proper subsets. Alrighty, let's wrap this up. In this cringe-filled beautiful collab, we've laid the foundation of our series on the Kalam Cosmological argument. We began with a brief history of the argument, traversing from the eternal universe of Aristotle to the finite universe of Craig. We then compartmentalized the argument into its two stages, with the first aiming to substantiate a first cause, and the second aiming to identify the first cause as God. Pivoting from this, we discussed the differences between the old and new Kalam, namely the latter's marriage to causal finitism. Finally, we gave the standard objection to the argument from the absurdity of infinites of different sizes, which we'll expand upon in the relevant episode. Now, we appreciate that this has been a lot to take in, but since our goal is to make things as simple as possible to follow, we felt it best to start with what is, let's face it, a somewhat dry foundation. Clear language is the bedrock of communication, especially when delving into unintuitive philosophy. As Joe revealed earlier, in the next video we're going to focus on the old Kalam, and more specifically the causal principle and purported scientific evidence supporting the universe's beginning from Big Bang cosmology. It will include a story pertaining to pigeon poo, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, then be sure to subscribe to us both. And if you happen to have an unquenchable thirst for Kalam content right now, then be sure to head over to Joe's channel. Those wonderful conversations I mentioned earlier are just sitting there waiting for you to watch them. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means.